Tonight, the debates over gun control. The Senate, they're about to vote on a series of gun control measures in the wake of Orlando. We'll have the latest from Washington, and we'll be speaking with Congressman Jim Himes. All that coming up. And then, he escaped every pitfall during the Republican primaries, but now there are real signs that Donald Trump's campaign may be in real trouble. We will ask our panel and an expert from Politico. And then, 3 top commanders in the NYPD arrested and charged with corruption. The question now is, could Bill de Blasio be next in the crosshairs of one Preet Bharara? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we begin tonight with what has been a major day of developments in the national debate over guns and gun control. This, as 911 tapes of calls between the Orlando gunman and police were released today, at least released in full. The killer keeping police at bay for 3 hours with threats of bombs that it turned out did not exist. His demeanor, calm, as he described himself as an Islamic soldier. As for the push for greater gun control, a major victory from the Supreme Court today. Justices refusing to hear an appeal of a case banning assault weapons in New York and Connecticut, effectively legalizing those bans. Now, both states adopting the assault weapons bans after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. In another major case related to Sandy Hook, in a Connecticut courthouse today, families of the Sandy Hook victims arguing that they should be allowed to sue gun manufacturers. The Remington Gun Company wants the case dismissed, setting a liability shield for the industry that was passed by Congress. The judge did not rule today. But the real action on guns, it is in the U.S. Senate as we speak. That is where votes are being cast on a series of 4 gun control proposals. 2 from the Democrats with real teeth and 2 from Republicans, which would bring fewer real changes. Now, those Democratic bills are being called no fly, no buy. Basically, that would stop anyone on the no-fly list from being able to buy a gun. It would also lower the standard for refusal for probable cause to reasonable belief. Now, as for the Republicans, they're against a ban, advocating a 3-day wait period instead that they say will allow for a period to clarify if the person is really a danger. But anyone on those lists, they'd still be able to buy guns if no answer comes back within 72 hours. So with so many developments in the gun debate both on and off Capitol Hill today, we decided to turn to Connecticut, where Congressman Democrat Jim Himes. Any reason to be optimistic that any of the bills before the Senate will pass tonight? By recent head counts, it doesn't look good.
Yeah, it doesn't look good, and I'm not sure that any of us thought that just 1 week of work and a sort of newly activated group of people would necessarily do the trick. But we're keeping our fingers crossed. You know, there's a real effort out there to place phone calls into all senators, particularly those swing senators' offices, to see if we can't get to the 60 that it would need to advance. But, you know, as I told people over the weekend, even if we don't win on this particular Monday, you know, we've got to keep the pressure up. We've got to keep talking about gun safety as something that the vast majority of the American public supports, and just keep, you know, nose to the grindstone, because eventually we will prevail.
I was just looking at some of the proposed amendments, one from Senator Grassley. Forget that his amendment would make sure they wouldn't close that private sale loophole. It would allow an individual to regain the ability to buy a gun as soon as he gets out of a mental institution for which he was involuntarily committed, and also let veterans who suffer from PTSD and serious mental illness or even risk of suicide to buy guns. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but who thinks that way? I don't get how anyone thinks that's good public policy.
Yeah, look, you know, sadly we're in a world where the Republican Party has decided that they will do the bidding of the most extremist anti-gun safety zealots. And, you know, it's really perplexing, because you can just name commonsensical thing after commonsensical thing that 90% of Americans would agree with. Universal background checks. I mean, guess what? Today, if you buy a gun online or in a gun show, you may not have to undergo a background check. That's just crazy. You know, the Congress has prohibited the Centers for Disease Control, which, you know, is all about public safety, from doing research on this epidemic. epidemic of gun violence. I mean, I could just go on and on and on with a steady stream of things that are just beyond the pale in terms of their sheer stupidity, that we can at least talk about them. But, you know, sadly, the folks who are saying no, nothing, never, anytime, they understand that once we start to have this conversation, they lose, because these things are so commonsensical. So the moment we start to seriously consider them, the question is, how could you be opposed to something like universal background checks? So instead, they devolve to a world, well, this is all part of the effort to take away your guns, America, which is just insane. But the one asset they have, since there is not a fact or an analysis or any science behind the idea that if we didn't take some gun safety measures, we'd be a safer society, all they have is fear. And that's going to drive an attitude of we won't have any conversations about this.
Your colleague, Senator Murphy, we shared with our audience last week what he said from the floor at the end of that filibuster. And we also spoke to the mother whose child he held the photograph of. You also decided, actually when you were watching a documentary about the Newtown massacre and the people years later, remembering that fateful day and how it changed so many lives, you decided that no more moments of silence for you when you saw that. In fact, I think you were speaking to Mark Barton, who lost his son Daniel, a 7-year-old in Newtown. Tell the audience why you decided no more moments of silence and why you decided to stand up and change at least the dynamic, at least for yourself.
Sure. Well, look, I've got no problem with moments of silence in stadiums and churches and homes and all that sort of thing. But in the House of Representatives, you know, the one place in this country where with about 2 hours of work, we could pass some measures which would in no way infringe on people's Second Amendment rights, but which would keep a lot of Americans alive. If instead of actually doing that 2 hours of work and maybe showing some political courage for some members of Congress, if our answer is, sorry, we're not going to do that, Mark Barton, whose 7-year-old son was murdered at Sandy Hook. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to just briefly pause in our conversations. For 7 or 8 seconds, we're going to stop talking about sports and dinner and Donald Trump, and we're just going to put our most serious faces on, and we're going to be quiet for 7 or 8 seconds. That's appalling. If that's all that we can offer humans who are our fellow humans who are going through unimaginable grief and loss, shame on us. So I just decided, look, I'm not going to participate any longer in this charade of concern, because if the Congress had one iota of concern, if it had one filament of moral courage, instead of being quiet, we would actually get some work done and pass some of these things which would keep a lot of Americans safe.
Finally, Congressman, over the weekend you probably heard the NRA make a not-so-veiled threat that if any Republican dares to support any of this proposed legislation, they can be guaranteed a primary. Is that the dirty secret here? Is that what's driving a lot of your colleagues who'd vote otherwise?
That's a little bit of it. Look, the NRA is not as powerful as people think that it is. What the NRA does is it just generates a steady flow of crazy fear. You know, Barack Obama's going to take your gun away. You need a gun because if an intruder is in your home, that's your only line of defense. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. You're safer with a gun than without one. All of that stuff is total baloney, but they are purveyors of fear, and, you know, hence they're doing what they do with members of Congress, trying to make them afraid to do something that those members of Congress, constituents, want them to do. But it's time for people to see the NRA for what it is. Look, you know, the NRA when I was a kid represented your average gun owner out there. They were all about training on how to fire that .22 as a kid, and, you know, how families can enjoy firearms together. Today they are purveyors of insane fear, and America needs to understand that that's what they do, and that that they are responsible for a big part of our inability to actually do some things which Second Amendment supporters like me would be very, very comfortable with, but they just say no, never, nothing, nada. And, you know, they therefore are partly responsible for this carnage that we see throughout our country.
Congressman Himes, as always, I appreciate the time. I wish it was on a different subject, but nonetheless, thanks.
Thank you, Richard.
And that, Congressman Himes, let me show you a live picture now of the floor of Congress. As we said, they're voting tonight. In fact, there's 4 amendments they're looking at. One has already been voted on. And I want you to listen to this. Remember that bill I showed you a few minutes ago, the Grassley proposal? That got a plurality of votes. every Republican, I believe, with maybe one exception, I believe every single Republican voted for it. Now, it didn't get the magic number of 60 to be enacted, but remember, that would have made it clear for somebody who was involuntarily committed to a mental institution to be able to get a gun as soon as they were released. That also made it able for a veteran who either had PTSD or had expressed suicidal concerns to be able to get a gun. Every Republican in Congress, as we understand tonight, voted for it. Now they're getting ready to do the next vote, which will be on background checks at gun shows. That from Senator Murphy. Remember, he, the Connecticut senator who did that emotional filibuster at the end of the night that led us to where we are today, at least having some votes. We'll keep you informed as to what goes on in Washington for the balance of the evening, but don't expect anything to get through. All right, now when we come back, we will have the latest from not only Washington, but also our political panel. They'll weigh in as to where we are right now in the gun debate in America.